Here's the thing about being a kid in Tudor times that'll blow your mind. Roughly 1 in 4 children never saw their 5th birthday. About half wouldn't make it past age 10. Let that sink in. In your average Tudor classroom, half those kids wouldn't survive to adulthood. Parents had lots of children, knowing full well that many wouldn't survive. This wasn't some distant tragedy. It was everyday life. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, let's head back to Tudor England, 1526. Trust me, it's going to be quite a ride. But first, get comfortable. Seriously, adjust those pillows, pull up that blanket, because where we're going, you're going to want to be cozy. So congratulations, you just woke up as 7-year-old Edward Radcliffe, son of Sir Thomas Radcliffe, a minor noble in the court of King Henry VIII. It's not your modern bedroom with soft sheets and a memory foam mattress. Nope. You're waking up on a straw-filled mattress in the upper chamber of your family's manor house in Hampshire. A sliver of grey dawn light sneaks through the wooden shutters covering the small window. The room is chilly, damn cold actually. There's no central heating here, just the dying embers of last night's fire in the small fireplace across the room. The heavy wool blankets covering you are scratchy against your skin, and the linen sheets beneath you aren't much better. Your nose twitches at the familiar smells of your bedchamber, the sweet sour scent of the rushes on the floor mingled with dried herbs like lavender and rosemary that were scattered among them to mask less pleasant odours. There's the faint smell of smoke from the fire and the earthy aroma of the wooden beams above your head. You're not alone in this room. Your 2 younger brothers, George and Henry, aged 5 and 3, are still sleeping in their trundle bed nearby. As the eldest son, you get to sleep in a proper bed rather than on a simple pallet on the floor. The sound of movement downstairs tells you the household is already stirring. Servants are up before dawn, preparing for the day. Your father, being a nobleman, will have business to attend to. Your mother will oversee the household affairs. "Oh, Master Edward," comes a voice as the door creaks open. It's Alice, your family's most trusted servant, carrying a small tallow candle that casts flickering shadows on the walls. "Time to rise, young master. Your tutor will be waiting. Not like today when kids can sleep in on weekends or school holidays. Tudor children, especially from noble families, kept strict schedules. Your day is about to begin, and it will be packed with activities meant to prepare you for adulthood." With a yawn, you push back the covers. The chill of the morning air hits you immediately, making your skin prickle. No lazy morning stretches here. You need to get moving to stay warm. Unlike your comfy bed at home right now, Tudor beds were lumpy affairs that often housed bedbugs and fleas. Even in wealthy households, these uninvited bedfellows were common companions. "Your prayers, Master Edward," Alice reminds you gently. "Oh right, before anything else, before even getting dressed, you must kneel beside your bed and recite your morning prayers. Religion isn't just part of Tudor life, it's woven into every moment of every day. Even as a child, you're expected to know your prayers and say them faithfully each morning and night. You kneel on the cold wooden floor, the chill seeping through the thin linen of your night shift, and begin to recite the Lord's Prayer in Latin. Pater Noster, quies in caelis. This is 1526, remember. Henry VIII hasn't broken with Rome yet. England is still a Catholic country. Every child, whether noble or common, learns these prayers by heart from the earliest age. Forgetting them or refusing to say them isn't an option. Prayer finished, it's time to get dressed. And damn, this is nothing like pulling on your comfy jeans and t-shirt. First, Alice helps you into a clean linen shirt that reaches to your knees. This is your underwear, essentially, but you'll wear it day and night, changing it maybe once a week if you're lucky. On top of that goes your doublet, a close-fitting jacket made of wool, with buttons down the front and a small collar. The wool is scratchy against your neck, but it's warm. Next come the hose, not tights exactly, but separate legs that tie to your doublet with laces called points. Getting these on without them twisting or bunching is an art form. The hose are made of wool too, dyed a deep russet colour that marks your status as the son of a gentleman. "Stand still, Master Edward," Alice chides as she works to lace everything properly. "Your father would be displeased to see you slovenly dressed." Appearances matter tremendously in Tudor England. Even for a child, clothing signals your place in the rigid social hierarchy. Your outfit is modest compared to what the children of higher-ranking nobles might wear, but it's still a far cry from a peasant boy's simple garments. Once you're dressed, Alice brings a basin of water for washing. It's cold. Heating water is a luxury, even in a noble household like yours. You splash your face and hands quickly, teeth chattering. No full-body showers here. Tudors weren't actually as dirty as people think. But daily bathing as we know it wasn't a thing. You might get a proper bath once every few weeks. Alice hands you a small bone comb to tidy your hair. It's kept short, just below your ears, in the fashion appropriate for a boy your age. Girls, meanwhile, would have their hair bound up under caps or coifs once they reached about 6 or 7 years old. Your father awaits you in the hall for breaking fast, Alice tells you, as she straightens your collar one last time. Breakfast in Tudor England isn't the most important meal of the day. In fact, many adults skip it entirely, but children are usually given something to eat in the morning, especially in wealthy households where food is plentiful. You make your way down the narrow wooden staircase, your leather shoes making soft tapping sounds on the steps. The great hall of your family's manor is already busy with activity. Servants move about, setting up trestle tables for the day's meals. Your father sits at the high table, reviewing some papers, likely accounts or correspondence. "Good morning, father," you say, with a small bow. Children in Tudor times showed extreme deference to their parents. You wouldn't speak unless spoken to first, and physical affection like hugs or kisses wasn't common between parents and children in noble households. "Edward," your father acknowledges with a nod. "I trust you are ready for your lessons." "Yes, father." Your breakfast is brought to you, a small manchet loaf, the finest white bread reserved for the upper classes, with a bit of butter and a wooden cup of watered-down ale. Yes, ale. Even children drink alcohol in Tudor England since water often isn't safe. Don't worry, it's very weak, but still odd to think about 7-year-olds drinking ale with breakfast. As you eat, you notice your mother entering the hall with your younger sister, Elizabeth, who's 9. Girls in noble families aren't educated the same way as boys. While you're preparing for a future that might include university, government service, or managing the family estates, Elizabeth is being groomed for marriage and running a household. "Good morning, Mother," you and Elizabeth say almost in unison, both giving small bows. Your mother, dressed in a fine wool gown with a white linen partlet covering her neck and chest, nods in acknowledgement. "Edward, Master Smithson is waiting in the library. Elizabeth, you will join me today for instruction in needlework and household accounts." Master Smithson is your tutor, hired by your father to provide you with the education befitting a gentleman's son. At 7, you're considered ready for more formal studies. Before this, you learned basic reading and numbers, along with proper behaviour and religious instruction from your mother and the household chaplain. You finish your bread quickly and make your way to the small library, really just a room with a desk, some chairs, and a modest collection of books. Books are expensive, handmade items in Tudor England. Your family's dozen or so volumes represent significant wealth. Master Smithson, a thin man with a serious expression, is already waiting. He studied at Oxford and now earns his living teaching the children of the gentry. "You're late, Master Edward," he says sternly, though you're not really. Punctuality is strictly enforced for Tudor children. We begin with Latin. Latin is the foundation of a proper Tudor education. It's the language of the church, law, medicine, and international diplomacy. You'll spend hours conjugating verbs and memorizing grammar rules. Amo, amus, amat, you recite, the familiar pattern of the Latin verb to love. Master Smithson nods, unsmiling. Continue. Amamus, amatis, amant. You finish. The morning stretches before you. 3 or 4 hours of Latin, followed by lessons in mathematics, writing practice, and religious studies. You learn not just from books, but from copying texts onto a slate board with chalk, or sometimes onto parchment with a quill pen if you're practicing your best penmanship. There are no weekends off. Tudor children in school study 6 days a week, with only Sunday set aside for church and limited recreation. The school day typically runs from dawn until dusk, with a brief break for the midday meal. And discipline, it's harsh by modern standards. That birch rod leaning in the corner of the room isn't for show. Corporal punishment is common and expected. A mistake in your Latin conjugations, sloppy handwriting, or a moment of daydreaming might earn you a sharp rap across the knuckles or worse. "Focus, Edward," Master Smithson says sharply, noticing your attention wandering to the window where you can see other children, servants' children, carrying water from the well. "A gentleman must have mastery of his mind." You straighten immediately. "Yes, Master Smithson." It might seem harsh, but in Tudor England, childhood isn't viewed as a special protected time of innocence and play. Rather, it's seen as preparation for adult responsibilities. By age 7, you're already on the path to adulthood, learning the skills and knowledge you'll need for your future role. For noble boys like you, that future likely includes managing estates, perhaps serving at court or in government, and upholding your family's position in society. Your education reflects these goals. You'll learn not just academic subjects, but also riding, hunting, dancing, and proper manners, all essential skills for a Tudor gentleman. Girls from noble families have a different educational path. Your sister Elizabeth's day includes some reading and writing, perhaps a bit of French, music lessons on the lute or virginals, an early keyboard instrument, and extensive training in needlework, household management, and the medicinal uses of herbs and plants. She's being prepared for her future role as a wife and mother, managing a household and raising children. By mid-morning, your stomach is starting to rumble again. The small breakfast has worn off, and lunchtime, or dinner as the main meal is called in Tudor England, is still hours away, typically served around 11 o'clock. "Let us turn to arithmetic," Master Smithson announces, putting aside the Latin texts. "A merchant has 3 barrels of wine. The first is 3/4 full, the second is half full, and the third is 1/4 full. If each barrel holds 20 gallons when full, how many gallons of wine does the merchant have in total?" You concentrate, working through the problem in your head. Math in Tudor times is practical, focused on the kinds of calculations necessary for trade, managing estates, and handling money. 30 gallons, Master Smithson, you answer after a moment. He nods, showing rare approval. Correct. Through the window you can hear the sounds of the manor farm, chickens clucking, a cow lowing, the distant shouts of the farm labourers. Somewhere a dog barks. The smell of bread baking in the kitchen wafts in, making your stomach growl louder. Tudor life is full of sensory experiences, not all of them pleasant. The smells can be overwhelming in a world without modern sanitation. Even in wealthy homes like yours, the combined odours of people, animals, cooking and waste create a pungent atmosphere that modern noses would find hard to bear. Now, your writing practice, Master Smithson says, placing a sheet of paper before you. Paper is expensive, so you must be careful not to waste it. Copy this passage from Cicero, paying attention to your letter forms. You dip the quill in the inkwell and begin to write carefully. A blot or smudge will earn you a rap across the knuckles. The quill scratches against the paper as you form each letter with concentration. Outside, the morning is advancing. Sunlight now streams through the window, falling across your desk. In the courtyard, you can hear your younger brothers being allowed some playtime before their simpler lessons begin. At 5 and 3, they're still considered too young for rigorous education, though they're already learning basic prayers, manners, and letters. Your mother passes by the open door, pausing briefly to glance in. She's on her way to the kitchen to oversee preparations for the midday meal. Running a Tudor household is a complex job requiring knowledge of food storage, preservation, cooking, medicine, textile production, and management of servants. Your sister follows behind her, learning by observation and practice. The morning continues with your studies, the room growing warmer as the sun rises higher. Unlike children today, you don't fidget or complain about being inside on a nice day. Tudor children, especially from noble families, are taught strict self-control from an early age. We will conclude the morning with religion, Master Smithson says eventually, closing the arithmetic book. He opens a Latin prayer book, pointing to a passage. Read, and then we shall discuss the meaning. Religion isn't just a subject to study, it's the framework for understanding the entire world in Tudor England. Every natural phenomenon, from thunder to illness to a good harvest, is seen as an expression of God's will. Children absorb this worldview from infancy. As you read the Latin passage aloud, carefully pronouncing each word, you're aware that mistakes in religious instruction are taken especially seriously. Blasphemy or heresy, even from a child, could have serious consequences. The Tudor period is a time of religious flux and tension, as new ideas from the Reformation begin to challenge traditional Catholic teachings. Though you're only 7, you've already learned to be cautious about religious matters, to say the right prayers and make the proper observances. Your family's position and prosperity depend in part on being on the right side of both earthly and divine authority. The passage is from the Gospel of Matthew about honouring one's father and mother. Master Smithson asks you to explain its meaning. It teaches us to obey our parents in all things, you answer carefully, as God has placed them in authority over us. Good, he nods. And what does the commandment promise to those who honour their parents? That their days may be long in the land, you recite from memory. Remember this well, Master Smithson says, more gently than usual. Obedience to proper authority, to parents, to the king, to the church, this is the foundation of a godly and orderly life. For Tudor children, obedience isn't just good behaviour, it's a moral and religious obligation. Respect for hierarchy and authority is instilled from the earliest age. Children who question or disobey face not just punishment, but the suggestion that they're sinning against the divine order. The sound of a bell rings through the manor house. It's nearly time for dinner, the main meal of the day, served at around 11 o'clock. Your morning lessons are done, but the day is far from over. After eating, you'll have more lessons, perhaps some supervised physical activity, like archery practice, and then evening prayers before bed. You may go, Master Smithson says, gathering his books. We will continue with Latin composition after dinner. You stand, bow respectfully, and leave the library. Your legs are stiff from sitting still all morning, but you don't run or skip through the house. That would be considered undignified behavior for a noble child. Instead, you walk properly, back straight, at a measured pace, toward the hall where the household will gather for the meal. In the great hall, servants are setting the long trestle tables. Your father sits at the high table with a visitor, a neighbouring landowner discussing some business matter. Your mother directs the servants with quiet efficiency, making sure everything is properly arranged according to the strict protocols of Tudor dining. Your place is at the high table, but below the salt, a large salt cellar that divides the table and marks social distinctions. Those seated above the salt are of higher status. Those below, including children, even the children of the house, are of lower status. Even at the dinner table, Tudor social hierarchy is clearly displayed. The food arrives, far more plentiful than what most people in Tudor England eat, but still limited by season and preservation methods. There's a vegetable pottage, a thick soup, freshly baked bread, some cold sliced beef from yesterday's roast, a small pie filled with pigeons and apples from the manor's orchard. You take your place, waiting for your father to be served first, then your mother, then the guest, before you or your siblings may begin eating. Table manners are strict. No reaching, no talking with food in your mouth, using your knife properly and keeping your place tidy. The meal passes with little conversation from the children. Tudor children, especially at the table, are expected to be seen and not heard unless specifically addressed by an adult. Your younger brothers, seated further down the table with their nursemaid, are still learning this discipline. 3-year-old Henry occasionally forgets and chatters, earning himself a stern look from your father. As you eat, you listen to the adults' conversation. Your father and his guest discuss the king's latest proclamation, the price of wool, and news from London. Tudor children, particularly boys destined for positions of responsibility, are encouraged to learn about adult concerns from an early age. There's no concept of shielding children from adult topics like politics or business. After dinner, there's a brief period of rest. The adults might have some wine and continue their discussions, while children have a little more freedom, but it doesn't last long. Soon enough, it's time to return to your lessons. The afternoon stretches ahead, filled with more Latin, some history, and perhaps some instruction in music or drawing if there's time. Tudor education for noble children is comprehensive, designed to produce well-rounded individuals prepared for their place in society. And this is just one morning in the life of a Tudor child from the nobility. Across England, countless other children are experiencing very different mornings in craftsmen's workshops, on farms, in village schools, or in royal palaces. Their days are shaped by their social class, gender, location, and the specific moment in the tumultuous Tudor period. Tomorrow, we'll see what life is like for a different Tudor child, perhaps a farmer's daughter or a city apprentice. The contrast will be stark because in Tudor England, where you're born determines almost everything about your childhood experience, what you eat, how you dress, what you learn, and what future awaits you. But for now, young Edward returns to his books, the spring sunlight slanting through the library window, illuminating motes of dust that dance in the air as he bends over his Latin exercises, quill scratching on parchment, another hour of childhood ticking by in the great manor house in Hampshire. While young Edward Radcliffe was studying Latin with his tutor across the Hampshire countryside, another child was already hours into her day. Agnes Fletcher, 9 years old, had been awake since before dawn. No one had to wake her. The roosters did that job just fine. Agnes wasn't the daughter of a nobleman. Her father, John Fletcher, was a yeoman farmer, not the poorest sort, but certainly no gentleman. They had a small cottage with a thatched roof, 2 rooms downstairs and a sleeping loft above, and enough land to grow crops and keep some animals. The morning chill bit at Agnes's toes as she climbed down from the sleeping loft. Unlike Edward with his private bedchamber, Agnes shared the loft with her 4 siblings. Her older brother Will, who was 12, her younger sisters Mary and Joan, who were 6 and 4, and baby Thomas, who was barely 1 year old. They all slept on straw-filled mattresses laid directly on the wooden floor, covered with whatever blankets they had. In winter, they'd sleep huddled together for warmth. The cottage was dark, lit only by the glow of embers in the central hearth. Agnes's first job of the day, one she'd been doing since she was 7, was to coax those embers back to life. No fancy fireplace with a chimney like in Edward's manor house. Here the fire burned in the middle of the main room, the smoke finding its way out through a hole in the thatch above. "Come on now," she whispered to the glowing coals, carefully adding small pieces of kindling, dried twigs and straw she'd collected yesterday. She blew gently, her chapped lips stinging in the cold air. A small flame flickered to life. Success. Agnes added slightly larger sticks, nurturing the fire until it crackled properly. Her mother was already up, nursing baby Thomas. "Good girl," she said quietly, nodding at the growing fire. "Now fetch some water." Agnes grabbed the wooden bucket by the door. Outside, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten, painted in shades of grey and pale blue. Dew soaked the grass and mud squished beneath her bare feet as she made her way to the small stream that ran near their cottage. No servants to carry water for this family. Every drop used for cooking, cleaning, or washing had to be fetched by someone in the household. The water was so cold it made her hands ache as she filled the bucket. It was heavy too, sloshing as she lugged it back to the cottage. Some splashed on her simple linen smock, her only piece of clothing besides a woolen kirtle dress she'd put on later. By the time Agnes returned with the water, her father and older brother were up and preparing to head to the fields. Spring planting wouldn't wait, and the day's work needed to start early. "Porridge ready soon?" her father asked her mother, pulling on his worn leather boots. "As soon as Agnes gets the pot heating," her mother replied, adjusting baby Thomas at her breast. That was Agnes's cue. She hung the iron cooking pot on its hook over the fire and poured in some of the water she'd fetched. From a wooden barrel in the corner, she scooped out a measure of oats. No fine white manchet bread for breakfast here, like Edward might have. The Fletcher family's daily bread was dark and coarse, made from whatever grain they could grow or afford. The porridge would be plain, maybe flavoured with a little salt if they were lucky, or occasionally honey from their beehives. On special days there might be a bit of cheese or an egg to go with it, but not usually. Most mornings it was just porridge, day after day. As the oats began to simmer in the pot, Agnes's younger sisters woke up, climbing down from the loft with sleep-tousled hair and rubbing their eyes. "Go help your father and Will with the animals before breakfast," her mother told them. Even at 6 and 4, Mary and Joan had chores to do, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, carrying small tools. Tudor children entered the world of work early, regardless of their social standing. Agnes stirred the thickening porridge with a wooden spoon. The cottage was filling with the comforting smell of cooking oats and wood smoke. Her stomach growled. Unlike the gentry who might eat lightly in the morning and have their main meal at midday, farming families needed substantial food to start their day of physical labour. "Tell your father and brother the porridge is ready," her mother said, placing baby Thomas in a simple wooden cradle near the fire. Agnes stepped outside again. The sun was just peeking over the horizon now, casting long shadows across the muddy yard where chickens pecked for insects and their old dog, Patch, lay watching the activity with half-closed eyes. "Father, Will, breakfast!" she called toward the small barn where they were milking their 2 cows. Breakfast was a quick, simple affair. The family gathered around the trestle table, each with a wooden bowl of steaming porridge. They ate quickly with wooden spoons. No fancy table manners required here, though Agnes's mother did insist they say a prayer before eating. "Agnes, once you've finished, I need you to help me with the cheese making," her mother said between bites. "The milk from yesterday needs turning." Making cheese was one of many household skills Agnes was learning. By her age, she was already quite competent at a range of domestic tasks that would prepare her for her likely future as a farmer's wife. While Edward learned Latin and mathematics, Agnes learned how to preserve food, spin wool, make cheese, brew ale, and tend to younger children. After breakfast, her father and Will headed to the fields with their ox and plough. The younger girls were set to simple tasks, gathering eggs, sweeping the packed earth floor of the cottage, picking herbs from the small garden plot. Agnes helped her mother clear away the breakfast things, scraping the bowls clean and rinsing them with a little precious water. Nothing was wasted in a Tudor household, especially not among the common folk. "Now for the cheese," her mother said, pulling out a large earthenware crock containing yesterday's milk, which had been sitting overnight. Cheese-making was a precise art that Agnes had been learning since she was about 6. First, they skimmed off the cream from the top of the milk. That would be used to make butter later. Then they gently warmed the skimmed milk near the fire. "Not too hot," her mother cautioned. "Just warm enough to take the chill off." The next step was adding rennet, an enzyme from a calf's stomach that would cause the milk to curdle. Agnes's family, like most Tudor farmers, slaughtered their own animals and saved every usable part. Nothing was wasted. While they waited for the milk to curdle, Agnes's mother set her to spinning. A basket of cleaned and carded wool sat beside a simple drop spindle. "Your thread was too uneven yesterday," her mother said. "Practice more today." Agnes nodded and began the familiar task of drawing out the wool fibres and twisting them into thread. Unlike rich girls who might learn decorative embroidery, Agnes was learning practical textile skills, spinning thread that would later be woven into cloth for the family's clothes and household linens. Her fingers worked the wool while her mind wandered. Sometimes, on market days, she'd seen the fine ladies from the big houses in their colourful gowns with embroidery and lace. Agnes's own clothing was plain, functional, and often patched. Her kirtle, the main outer garment worn by women and girls, was made of coarse wool dyed a dull brown with walnut shells. She owned exactly 2 sets of clothes, one to wear while the other was being washed, which didn't happen very often. By mid-morning, the milk had separated into curds and whey. Agnes helped her mother carefully ladle the curds into a cheesecloth-lined wooden mould. The whey drained off and was collected in a bucket. It wouldn't be wasted, but used to feed the pigs or even drunk by the family. "Press it firmly," her mother instructed, showing Agnes how to squeeze out the excess moisture. "But not so hard you push out all the cream." This cheese would be a simple farmer's cheese, eaten fresh within a few days. For special occasions or to preserve milk longer, they made harder cheeses that could age for months. While they worked, her mother sang a simple folk tune, and Agnes joined in. This was how knowledge was passed down, not through books or formal lessons, but through doing, watching, and remembering. Agnes was learning by being her mother's shadow, absorbing the hundreds hundreds of skills needed to run a Tudor household. By the time the cheese was pressed and set aside to drain further, it was nearly time to begin preparing the midday meal. Agnes's father and brother would come in from the fields, hungry after a morning of hard physical labour. "Go to the garden and pull some leeks and carrots," her mother told her, "and check if any of the early cabbages are ready." The family's garden plot was small but vital, providing most of the vegetables they ate. Unlike the gentry who could afford imported spices and luxuries, common folk ate what they could grow or raise themselves, supplemented by what little they could afford to buy or trade for. Agnes pulled several leeks from the soft soil and brushed off the dirt. She found a few winter carrots still good for eating and checked the cabbages, but they weren't quite ready yet. On her way back to the cottage, she plucked some fresh herbs, thyme and sage, that grew wild along the path. Inside, her mother had a pot of pottage, a thick soup or stew that was a staple of the Tudor diet, already starting over the fire. Into it would go whatever vegetables were available, perhaps some barley or dried peas, and if they were lucky, a small piece of salt pork for flavour. Agnes chopped the vegetables on a wooden board with a small knife, her movements confident despite her young age. By 9, she was trusted with tasks that modern parents might consider dangerous for children, but in Tudor England, children were integrated into household work early, handling knives, fire, and animals as a matter of course. "We need more water for the pottage," her mother said, glancing at the nearly empty bucket. Agnes sighed but picked up the bucket without complaint. Multiple trips to the stream were a daily reality. As she stepped outside, she saw Mary and Joan playing a simple game with pebbles in the dirt yard, giggling as they tossed and caught the small stones. "Mother says to feed the chickens when you're done playing," Agnes told them, feeling very grown-up and responsible compared to her younger sisters. The gulf between 9 and 6 seemed enormous in terms of expectations and responsibilities. Water fetched and vegetables added to the pot, Agnes's next job was to knead the bread dough that had been rising since early morning. Bread was baked only once or twice a week in most farmhouses to save on precious firewood. The dough was prepared in a large wooden trough and left to rise slowly. Agnes pushed her sleeves up and plunged her hands into the dough, feeling it squish between her fingers. She pushed and folded, working the air out of the sticky mass. It was hard work for young arms, but she was used to it. "Good," her mother nodded, checking her progress. "Now, shape the loaves." Agnes divided the dough and formed several round loaves, placing them on a floured board to rise again before baking. As midday approached, Agnes's father and brother returned from the fields for their main meal. Their faces were ruddy from work and weather, hands calloused and dirt-ingrained. Will, at 12, already worked alongside his father doing a man's labour. Just as Agnes was learning to be a housewife, Will was learning to be a farmer by doing the work day in and day out. The family gathered again around the table for their main meal. Pottage ladled into wooden bowls, bread torn from yesterday's loaf, and a small piece of cheese for each person. They washed it down with weak ale, the everyday drink even for children, as water was often unsafe. The ale was brewed by Agnes's mother, another household skill that Agnes would soon learn. "The north field needs clearing of stones before we can finish ploughing," her father said between bites. "Will and I will do that this afternoon. Agnes, your mother needs help with the washing." Agnes nodded. Laundry was one of the most back-breaking household tasks, done only every few weeks or even months in many homes. It involved hauling endless buckets of water, scrubbing clothes with homemade lye soap on a washboard, boiling linens in a large copper kettle over an outdoor fire, then rinsing and wringing them out before hanging them to dry. The afternoon would be spent in this labour, her hands raw and chapped from the harsh soap and cold water, but Agnes wouldn't complain. This was simply what life was. After the midday meal, her father and brother returned to the fields. Agnes and her mother cleared away the dishes, then began the massive undertaking of wash day. "We'll start with the linens," her mother decided, gathering up the family's few sheets and shirts. They worked outside, setting up a large wooden tub. Agnes made countless trips to the stream for water while her mother built a fire to heat some of it. The soiled linens were first soaked in cold water, then scrubbed with rough soap made from animal fat and wood ash. Agnes's fingers ached from the scrubbing and the cold water, but she kept at it. Next came the most difficult part. The linens were placed in the copper kettle with more soap and boiled over the fire, stirred occasionally with a long wooden stick. "Mind you don't splash yourself," her mother warned as Agnes helped stir the steaming pot. Burns were a common household injury, especially on wash days. After boiling, the linens had to be rinsed in clean water, wrung out by hand and hung on bushes or a rope line to dry in the spring breeze. By the time they finished, Agnes's arms felt like lead and her back ached from bending over the wash tubs. Yet the day's work wasn't done. There were still the evening chores, bringing in more firewood, tending the animals, preparing the evening meal. In a farmer's household, work was constant from dawn until dusk. While Agnes worked alongside her mother, her education continued, not from books or formal lessons, but through oral tradition and hands-on experience. She learned which plants could be used for dyeing cloth, which herbs might ease a toothache or settle a stomach, how to tell when bread was baked just right, and how to predict weather changes by watching the sky and animals. "See how the swallows are flying low?" her mother pointed out as they hung the laundry. "We'll have rain by tomorrow." This practical knowledge was far more valuable to Agnes's future than Latin or arithmetic would have been. As a farmer's wife, she would need to run a household, raise children, preserve food, make medicine, and help with farm work. Unlike Edward, whose education prepared him for a life of relative privilege, Agnes's education prepared her for survival in a world where life was fragile and hardship common. By the time she reached adulthood, if she survived childhood, which was far from certain, she would need to be strong, skilled, and resourceful. As the afternoon waned, Agnes's younger sisters were set to picking stones from the dried peas that would go into tomorrow's pottage. Even at 4 and 6, they had useful tasks to perform. Tudor childhoods were short, with adult responsibilities beginning early. Agnes herself took charge of baby Thomas while her mother prepared the evening meal. Another pot of pottage, though thinner than the midday version, perhaps with a bit of bacon added if they were fortunate. She bounced the baby on her hip, a skill she'd been practicing since she was barely more than a toddler herself. Looking after younger siblings was one of the first responsibilities given to Tudor girls. "He's cutting a tooth," Agnes told her mother, noticing Thomas's red cheeks and drool. Her mother nodded, reaching into a small pouch hung by the hearth. "Rub a bit of this on his gums," she said, handing Agnes a tiny amount of honey mixed with crushed herbs. "It will ease the pain." Agnes dabbed the mixture on her brother's swollen gums, soothing him as he fussed. These remedies, passed down through generations of women, were the only healthcare most Tudor families had access to. There were no doctors for common folk, only the knowledge of herbs and treatments preserved in oral tradition. As the shadows lengthened across the yard, Agnes's father and brother returned from the fields, tired and hungry. The family gathered once more around the table for their evening meal. Compared to the elaborate dinners served in Edward's manor house, with multiple courses and servants to wait on the family, the Fletchers' supper was simple fare: pottage, bread, perhaps some cheese, and ale. After supper, there was still work to be done. Candles or rushlights were too expensive to use regularly, so the family made the most of the fading daylight. Agnes helped her mother mend torn clothing by the light from the hearth fire. Her father and brother repaired tools or worked on crafting new ones. The younger children were set to carding wool, teasing it out with simple wooden combs to prepare it for spinning. As darkness fell completely, the family gathered around the fire for evening prayers. Though they couldn't read the Bible for themselves, none of them could read at all. They knew the Lord's Prayer and other common devotions by heart. Religion structured their days, just as it did for wealthy families, though with less ceremony. Finally, it was time for sleep. The fire was banked to keep embers alive until morning. Agnes and her siblings climbed the ladder to the sleeping loft, settling onto their straw mattresses fully clothed. They slept in the same garments they wore during the day. Their parents would sleep in the only bed downstairs near the fire, with baby Thomas in a cradle nearby. Agnes lay in the darkness, listening to her siblings' breathing and the occasional rustle of mice in the thatch above. Through gaps in the roof, she could see stars sprinkled across the night sky. Her body ached from the day's labour, but this was normal. She knew no other way of life. While Edward would grow up to manage estates or serve at court, Agnes's future was narrower, but no less important. By 15 or 16, she would likely marry a farmer or craftsman from a nearby village, bringing her household skills to a new home, bearing children and continuing the cycle of Tudor rural life. Her education wouldn't lead to books or scholarship, but it prepared her for survival in a harsh world. She could preserve food to last through winter, brew ale that wouldn't make her family sick, deliver a baby if needed, treat common ailments with herbs, spin thread and weave cloth, manage livestock, and 100 other practical skills that kept Tudor society functioning. As Agnes drifted towards sleep, her mind wasn't on Latin verbs or court etiquette, but on tomorrow's tasks, churning butter from the cream they'd skimmed, helping with more planting, perhaps gathering early spring greens from the woods to supplement their meals. Her childhood was passing quickly, heavy with responsibilities, but rich with practical knowledge that would serve her throughout her life. Both Agnes and Edward, though living just miles apart, inhabited different worlds within the same Tudor England. Their childhoods were shaped by birth and circumstance, preparing them for vastly different adult lives in a society where social mobility was rare and life paths were largely determined before birth. In the darkness of the sleeping loft, Agnes finally closed her eyes. Another day of her Tudor childhood complete, her calloused hands tucked under her cheek as she surrendered to exhaustion and sleep. The spring sun had barely cleared the rooftops of London when Thomas Baker was jolted awake by a sharp kick to his ribs. "Up, boy, the master wants the fire lit before he comes down." Thomas blinked sleep from his eyes and rolled quickly off his thin pallet on the workshop floor. His fellow apprentice, Peter, was already pulling on his clothes. At 13, Thomas was 4 years into his 7-year apprenticeship with Master William Cooper, one of London's respected coopers, craftsmen who made barrels, casks, buckets and tubs. Unlike Edward with his manor house education or Agnes on her family farm, Thomas lived in the crowded heart of London, learning a trade that would eventually make him a freeman of the city. "Coming," Thomas mumbled, fumbling for his clothes in the dim light. He slept in just a linen shirt and now pulled on his leather jerkin and woolen hose, both worn thin at the elbows and knees. His feet were tucked into wooden clogs that clattered on the wooden floor. The Cooper's house stood on a narrow street in the parish of St Olave Hart Street near the Tower of London. Like most London houses, it was tall and narrow, built of timber with the upper floors jutting out over the street. The ground floor held the workshop with its tools and supplies, while the family lived above and the apprentices slept wherever space could be found, usually the workshop floor. Thomas and Peter were just two of Master Cooper's 4 apprentices. The other 2, Henry and Martin, were older and in their 6th year of training. They slept in the attic room and, being senior apprentices, enjoyed slightly better accommodations and fewer menial tasks. The workshop was cold after the night, the fire having died to ash hours ago. Thomas knelt at the hearth, arranging kindling and blowing carefully to bring the flames to life. The smell of wood shavings and fresh timber permeated everything. After 4 years, Thomas's clothes, his hair, even his skin seemed permanently infused with the scent of oak and pine. "Hurry up with that fire, then fetch water," Peter hissed, already sweeping wood chips from yesterday's work into a pile. At 11, Peter was the newest apprentice, having joined the household just 6 months ago. He was still adjusting to the strict routine and long hours. Thomas worked quickly. The life of an apprentice was governed by rigid schedules and endless tasks. Their days started well before Master Cooper and his family rose, and often ended long after they retired. In between, there were barrels to make, deliveries to complete, tools to maintain, and countless household chores. Fire lit and blazing, Thomas grabbed 2 wooden buckets and headed for the door. "Don't dawdle this time," Peter called after him. "The mistress said she'd box your ears if you're late again." Thomas grimaced. Mistress Cooper, the master's wife, ran the household with iron efficiency. She was fair but strict, and not one to make idle threats. Her box on the ears 2 days ago, when Thomas had lingered too long watching a street performer, still stung his pride more than his ear. Outside, London was coming to life. The narrow streets were already filling with people, servants heading to the market, merchants opening shops, labourers looking for day work. The smells hit Thomas immediately, the sour odour of night soil being carted away, wood smoke from countless chimneys, the yeasty scent of a nearby bakery, and under it all, the constant dank smell of the Thames. Thomas made his way to the public conduit at the end of the street where water flowed through lead pipes from springs outside the city. Already a line was forming, maidservants with buckets, apprentices like himself, and the occasional housewife. Water was London's lifeblood, yet always in short supply. As Thomas waited his turn, he watched the city wake up around him. A group of children from poorer families darted past, probably heading to beg or scavenge near the markets. Unlike Thomas with his secured apprenticeship, many London children faced uncertain futures. Orphans, abandoned children, and those whose parents couldn't afford to place them in apprenticeships often lived by their wits, taking whatever work they could find, holding horses, running errands, or less savoury occupations. "You're Master Cooper's boy, aren't you?" asked the woman ahead of him in line, her own bucket nearly full. "Yes, mistress," Thomas answered politely, straightening his posture. An apprentice's behaviour reflected on his master, and Thomas had been taught to be respectful to all adults, particularly in public. "Tell your master my husband needs 3 small ale casks by Friday. He's the brewer at the White Hart." Thomas nodded. "I'll tell him, mistress." Business often happened this way in Tudor London, through casual conversations and personal connections rather than formal arrangements. As an apprentice, part of Thomas's education was learning these networks of commerce and obligation. With his buckets filled, Thomas hurried back to the Cooper's house, trying not to spill too much as he navigated the increasingly crowded street. A cart loaded with firewood rumbled past, forcing him against a wall. A pig rooted in the gutter, and somewhere a baby wailed. London assaulted all the senses, all the time. Back in the workshop, Master Cooper had appeared, a stocky man with a beard streaked with grey and hands gnarled from decades of shaping wood. "Good. "You're back," he grunted at Thomas. "Give one bucket to the mistress upstairs, then come help with this oak. We've the Vintners Guild order to finish today." Thomas handed one bucket to Peter to carry upstairs, then rolled up his sleeves for the day's real work. This was what he'd come for. Not the fetching and carrying, not the sleeping on a hard floor, but the craft itself. Coopering was a respected trade, and barrels were essential to Tudor commerce. Everything from ale to fish, from gunpowder to apples, was stored and transported in barrels. "We need 6 more hogsheads for the wine merchant," Master Cooper said, indicating the partially completed barrels. A hogshead was a large cask holding 63 gallons, one of many standard sizes that Thomas had learned to make by heart. The master began demonstrating the next step in the process, his movements quick and precise from years of practice. Thomas watched intently. This was how he learned, not from books or formal lessons, but from observation and repetition under his master's watchful eye. "Like this," Master Cooper said, showing how to shape a stave, one of the wooden segments that formed the barrel. "Feel the grain of the wood. Work with it, not against it." Thomas took the draw knife and began to shape his own stave, trying to match his master's technique. His first attempts years ago had been laughable, earning him plenty of cuffs and criticism. Now his hands moved with growing confidence, though still not with the fluid precision of the master or the older apprentices. "Better," Master Cooper nodded, inspecting Thomas's work. "You're finally developing a feel for it." That small praise warmed Thomas more than the workshop fire. Approval from the master was rare and therefore precious. The morning passed in focused work. The 2 senior apprentices, Henry and Martin, worked on assembling barrels, a more advanced skill that involved arranging staves in a frame, then using heat to make the wood pliable enough to bend into the familiar barrel shape. The smell of hot wood and the hiss of steam filled the workshop as they lowered a partially formed barrel over a small fire. Peter, being the newest, was relegated to the simplest tasks, sorting staves by size, sweeping up wood shavings, fetching tools. Thomas occupied the middle ground, trusted with making components but not yet with assembling them. At mid-morning, Mistress Cooper sent down her young maid with tankards of small beer and chunks of brown bread for the workers. Tudor labour was fuelled by beer, the everyday drink for everyone from children to the elderly. This wasn't strong stuff, just enough alcohol to make it safer than water. Thomas gulped his beer gratefully, using a piece of bread to soak up the last drops. Unlike Edward with his Latin texts or Agnes with her household tasks, his education was entirely practical, learning by doing day after day. "Thomas, you'll make the delivery to the Vintners Guild this afternoon," Master Cooper announced, wiping beer foam from his moustache. "Take the handcart. Martin will go with you." Thomas nodded, pleased with the responsibility. Deliveries meant a chance to see more of the city and interact with other craftsmen and merchants. For a boy who had come to London from a small village in Kent, the city remained endlessly fascinating despite its smells and dangers. The work resumed until the church bells rang for noon. In wealthy homes like Edward's, this would signal the main meal of the day, but apprentices ate when the work allowed, often later than their masters. "Finish that batch of staves before you eat," the master instructed, heading upstairs to his own dinner. Thomas worked steadily, the rhythmic scrape of his tools joining the general cacophony of London that filtered through the workshop windows. Street vendors crying their wares, church bells ringing, dogs barking, and the constant murmur of thousands of people going about their business. By the time he finished the staves, his stomach was growling fiercely. Upstairs, he joined the other apprentices at the kitchen table, where Mistress Cooper served them a simple but filling meal, pottage with more vegetables than meat, bread, and more small beer. Unlike Agnes's family meal where everyone ate together, Tudor apprentices typically ate separately from the master's family, though under the same roof. They were neither servants nor family members, but occupied a unique social position, legally bound to their master, who stood in place of their parents during the apprenticeship. "The mistress says you're to mend your jerkin after you eat," the kitchen maid told Thomas. "She saw the tear at the elbow and says it won't do for deliveries." Thomas nodded, his mouth full of bread. Apprentices were expected to maintain a respectable appearance, reflecting on their master's reputation. His parents had provided him with 2 sets of clothing when he began his apprenticeship 4 years ago, but he'd grown since then, and replacements came slowly. Most of his clothes had been taken in and let out multiple times as he shot up in height. After the meal, Thomas found needle and thread to repair his jerkin. Unlike noble boys who would have considered sewing women's work, apprentices had to be self-sufficient. Thomas could sew a serviceable seam, cook a basic meal, and manage other household tasks in addition to his developing craft skills. The afternoon brought the promised delivery. Thomas and Martin loaded the completed barrels onto a handcart, a simple wooden platform with handles at one end and a wheel at the other. London's streets were too narrow and crowded for horses and carts in many areas, so deliveries were often made this way. "I'll pull, you steer," Martin said, positioning himself between the handles. At 17 and nearly finished with his apprenticeship, he was stocky and strong from years of physical labour. Thomas took his position at the back of the cart and they set off toward Vintner's Hall near the river. The streets were even busier now than in the morning, a seething mass of humanity going about their business. They passed a group of schoolboys walking in formation behind their master, probably returning to their lessons after their midday meal. Unlike those boys in their grammar school, Thomas's education was all practical, focused on his craft rather than Latin and Greek. They passed shops of all kinds, a butcher with carcasses hanging in the open air, an apothecary with jars of mysterious substances, a mercer selling fine fabrics to wealthy customers. Each shop had its own distinctive sign hanging above the door, necessary in a city where many couldn't read. "Watch out," Martin called as a chamber pot was emptied from an upper window, its contents splattering in the street just ahead of them. This was city life, cramped, smelly, and often hazardous to health. Yet London offered opportunities that a village could not, particularly for an ambitious boy learning a trade. At Vintner's Hall, they were directed to the cellars where their barrels would be filled with wine imported from France and Spain. The Vintners Guild was one of London's 12 great livery companies, powerful organisations that controlled their respective trades. Master Cooper was a freeman of the Coopers' Guild, a status that Thomas himself might attain after completing his apprenticeship and producing a masterpiece, a perfect example of his craft. While Martin discussed the delivery with the cellarman, Thomas gazed around the impressive hall. Guilds were like extended families, providing not just business regulation, but social support, religious observance, and even education for members' children. If Thomas completed his apprenticeship successfully, he would enter this world of guild brotherhood, with all its privileges and responsibilities. "Dreaming again, Thomas?" Martin nudged him. "Come on, we need to get back. Master's got more work waiting." The return journey was easier with an empty cart. As they passed St. Paul's Cathedral, Thomas saw a group of choir boys around his age, dressed in their distinctive robes, heading in for afternoon services. Another type of education altogether. Those boys spent hours each day practicing music and singing, usually while living in a choir school attached to the cathedral. Back at the workshop, the afternoon stretched into evening with more barrel making. As the most experienced apprentice, Martin worked alongside Master Cooper on the most complex tasks. Henry, in his 6th year, worked independently on a smaller barrel. Thomas continued shaping staves and preparing metal hoops, while Peter kept the workshop tidy and the tools in order. "The brewers want another dozen firkins by month's end," Master Cooper announced, examining a piece of parchment that had been delivered during their absence. A firkin was a smaller barrel, holding about 9 gallons, used primarily for ale. "We'll need more oak. Thomas, tomorrow you'll go with me to the timber merchant." Thomas nodded, pleased with the assignment. Each new responsibility was a sign of his progress, a step closer to mastering his craft. As the daylight began to fade, candles were lit in the workshop, a luxury used only when necessary, as they were expensive. Work continued by this dim light until the evening bells rang from the nearby church. At last, tools were put away, the workshop swept one final time, and the day's work came to an end. Upstairs, Mistress Cooper had prepared the evening meal, more substantial than breakfast, but still simple fare. Salted fish, peas pottage, bread, cheese, and always more small beer. Apprentices ate quickly, too tired for much conversation. Their days typically ran from dawn until 8 or 9 at night, with few breaks and constant physical labour. Yet Thomas didn't consider his life particularly harsh. This was normal for Tudor apprentices. The security of food, shelter, and learning a valuable trade outweighed the long hours and strict discipline. After supper came a rare period of relative leisure. In some households, the master might read from the Bible or a book of sermons. Master Cooper, who couldn't read himself, instead used this time to further instruct his apprentices in the finer points of their craft, or to tell stories of London's past and the history of their trade. The Coopers Guild was granted its charter by Henry VII himself, he told them for perhaps the 100th time, but Thomas never tired of hearing it. "Our craft is older than the crown itself. Without barrels, trade stops. Without trade, England starves. Never forget the importance of what you're learning." Thomas nodded seriously. Unlike Agnes, whose education prepared her for a life much like her mother's, his apprenticeship was offering him a chance at something different, to be a skilled craftsman, a freeman of London, perhaps eventually a master with his own shop and apprentices. Before bed, they all knelt for evening prayers, led by Mistress Cooper. Religion structured Tudor lives regardless of social class, though with variations in practice. Here in London, just 20 years after the events in this story, religious practices would be dramatically transformed by Henry VIII's break with Rome and the establishment of the Church of England. Finally, as the city's night watchmen began their rounds calling the hours, Thomas and the other apprentices returned to their pallets. His muscles ached from the day's labour, and splinters peppered his hands despite years of developing calluses. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, an endless cycle of work, learning, and slow progress toward mastery. Yet, as he drifted towards sleep, Thomas felt a sense of purpose that neither Edward in his manor house nor Agnes on her farm might fully understand. In Tudor England, where most people lived and died in the same social position they were born into, apprenticeship offered one of the few paths to advancement. If he completed his term and became a freeman of the Coopers Guild, Thomas could rise to a level of prosperity and respect his farmer parents could never have achieved. London's sounds drifted through the shuttered windows, distant shouts, a snatch of drunken singing from a nearby tavern, the call of the night watch announcing 10 o'clock and all's well. Unlike the countryside where darkness brought near silence, the city never truly slept. Thomas's thoughts wandered to tomorrow's visit to the timber merchant. He'd been learning to judge the quality of wood, how to spot seasoned oak with a straight grain, perfect for barrel staves. Each such skill brought him closer to independence. In the darkness, Peter whimpered in his sleep. Still homesick after 6 months away from his family in Sussex, Thomas remembered his own first year, crying silently into his pallet at night, missing his mother's voice and his father's farm. But that homesickness had faded as London became familiar and coopering became not just a trade, but a source of pride. The guild system that governed Tudor crafts was both restrictive and protective. It controlled who could practice a trade and maintained standards through the long apprenticeship process, but it also provided security. A skilled cooper would never starve, would always find work in a society where virtually everything was stored and transported in wooden barrels. This structured path to adulthood was common for many Tudor boys from modest backgrounds. Girls occasionally entered apprenticeships too, though usually in feminine trades like seamstressing or millinery. Most, like Agnes, were prepared instead for marriage and household management. Thomas yawned, his eyes growing heavy. Above him, the Cooper's family slept in their proper beds with feather mattresses and linen sheets. Someday, he thought sleepily, he'd have a real bed too, and a shop of his own with apprentices sleeping on the floor. Someday, if he worked hard and learned well. London's many church bells tolled the hour across the city as Thomas finally surrendered to sleep, dreaming of perfect barrels and the freedom that mastery would bring. It was May Day in the village of Wickham, and for once the children weren't working. The morning sun bathed the village green in golden light as children from all walks of life gathered for one of the few holidays they truly got to enjoy. 10-year-old Eleanor, daughter of the village blacksmith, raced across the dewy grass, her normally braided hair flying loose behind her. Today was special. Today work could wait. "Come on, Sarah," she called to her younger sister. "They're raising the maypole." Indeed, at the centre of the green, men were erecting a tall pole decorated with spring flowers and long ribbons. Children gathered around in excited clusters, waiting for their chance to dance around it, weaving the colourful ribbons into patterns as they circled. Tudor children worked hard. God knows we've seen that with Edward, Agnes and Thomas, but they played hard too. Games and pastimes weren't just for fun. They were essential parts of Tudor life, building physical strength, teaching social skills and providing rare moments of joy in what could be a harsh existence. Eleanor and Sarah reached the edge of the green just as the maypole was secured upright. A cheer went up from the gathered villagers. May Day was one of the most beloved festivals in the Tudor calendar, a celebration of spring that had survived from pagan times, albeit with some Christian modifications. "Children first," called the May Lord, a local farmer's son who had been crowned with flowers for the day's festivities. "Take your ribbons." Eleanor grabbed a bright red ribbon while Sarah took a blue one. Other children, some barefoot labourers' children, some better dressed like the miller's sons, took their positions around the pole. The village musician struck up a tune on his pipe and the dance began. "Step in, step out, skip under, skip over," Eleanor whispered to her sister as they moved in the ancient pattern, ducking under some children's ribbons while others passed beneath theirs. Gradually, the ribbons formed a colourful weave around the pole. This maypole dance was more than just play. It was one of the few activities that brought together children from different social classes. The baker's son danced alongside the poorest cottager's daughter. For this one day, the rigid social divisions of Tudor society relaxed just a little. Once the maypole was properly decorated, other games began across the green. A group of boys played a rough version of football using a ball made from a pig's bladder, inflated and dried. Unlike modern football with its rules and boundaries, Tudor football was a chaotic free-for-all, with dozens of players, few rules and goals that might be a quarter-mile apart. "Look at them," said Sarah, watching the shouting, pushing mass of boys. "Mother says 3 boys broke arms at last year's game." Eleanor nodded. Tudor games, especially boys' games, were often dangerous by our standards. They were designed partly as training for the harsh realities of adult life and warfare. Boys were encouraged to engage in physical, sometimes violent play to build strength and courage. Near the edge of the green, younger children played blind man's buff. A boy with a cloth tied over his eyes stumbled around, trying to catch the others who darted around him, calling out taunts and then dancing away before he could grab them. "Want to play Nine Men's Morris?" asked Eleanor's friend Joan, approaching with a stick to draw the game board in the dirt. Nine Men's Morris was a strategy game played by people of all ages and classes in Tudor England. Even King Henry VIII was known to enjoy it. The game involved placing and moving counters on a board with the goal of forming mills, rows of 3 pieces, and capturing your opponent's pieces. Eleanor nodded eagerly. They scratched the distinctive grid pattern in a patch of bare earth and collected small stones to use as gaming pieces. Soon they were deep in concentration, plotting moves and counter-moves. Across the green, different games suited different ages. Toddlers played with simple toys, wooden hoops, whirligigs spun between the palms, or cup and ball toys where they tried to swing a ball on a string into a cup. Older children engaged in more complex games of skill and strategy. "Hoop race!" someone shouted, and several children grabbed wooden hoops and sticks. They lined up at one end of the green and at the signal began driving their hoops forward, keeping them rolling with taps from their sticks. Eleanor watched, cheering for her friends. Tudor children's games weren't so different from what kids played for centuries after. Many games like hopscotch, leapfrog and tag would be instantly recognisable to children today. What was different was the context. Play was a brief respite from work, not the expected state of childhood. As the morning wore on, Eleanor spotted the vicar's son, William, showing off a new toy to an admiring crowd of children. It was a ball attached to a cup by a string. The goal was to swing the ball and catch it in the cup, something William had clearly practiced as he performed the trick several times in succession. "My father bought it from a peddler in the market town," he boasted. "It's made of boxwood." Such store-bought toys were rare treasures in Tudor villages. Most toys were homemade from whatever materials were available: wood, clay, bone, or straw. Dolls might be carved from wood or made from rags, balls from wadded cloth or animal bladders, whistles from hollowed reeds. "Eleanor! Sarah!" Their mother's voice cut through the festivities. "Come and eat before the dancing starts again." The girls ran to where their family had spread a blanket on the grass. May Day was one of the few times in the year when ordinary people might enjoy a small feast. The blacksmith's family had bread, cheese, cold meat saved for the occasion, and small cakes sweetened with honey. Their father had even splurged on a jug of stronger ale than usual. "Can we go see the mummers after we eat?" Eleanor asked, tearing into a chunk of bread. "If you don't wander too far," her mother agreed. The mummers were a troupe of amateur actors who performed traditional plays on holidays. Today they were setting up at the far end of the green, preparing to act out the tale of St. George and the Dragon with wooden swords, painted shields, and elaborate masks made from painted cloth stretched over wooden frames. "Look, the hobby horse is coming," Sarah pointed excitedly. A man approached, bent over within a framework covered with painted cloth to resemble a horse, with a carved wooden horse head on a pole. He pranced and neighed, chasing shrieking children who ran away in mock terror. This was the side of Tudor childhood rarely recorded in official histories. The games, the laughter, the brief moments of joy snatched between work and responsibility. Rich or poor, noble or common, Tudor children found ways to play, using imagination to transform simple objects into sources of entertainment. After eating, Eleanor and Sarah joined a circle of girls playing Ring Around the Rosie. Though the familiar nursery rhyme wouldn't be written down until centuries later, similar singing games were already popular, with children holding hands, dancing in circles, and falling down at the appropriate moment. "The scholars say the song's about the plague," said an older girl knowingly. "The rosy is the rash, and all fall down is when people die." Eleanor shivered despite the warm day. Disease was an ever-present spectre in Tudor life, particularly for children. Almost every family had lost at least one child to illness. Games and rhymes often incorporated these dark realities, helping children process fears they couldn't escape. Not far away, a group of older boys had set up a crude archery range, using bows made from flexible branches and arrows tipped with wooden points rather than metal. Tudor law actually required all boys over age 7 to practice archery regularly. Though firearms were beginning to appear on battlefields, the longbow remained England's primary weapon, and every male was expected to master it. "My brother hit the target 3 times yesterday," a small boy boasted to Eleanor as they watched. "My father can split an arrow at 50 paces, she countered, though this was a considerable exaggeration. Near the church, some of the gentry's children were engaged in more refined pastimes. The manor lord's daughter and her friends played at courtly love, an elaborate game of make-believe where they pretended to be ladies and knights at the king's court. They performed stately dances they'd been taught by their dancing masters, and exchanged poetic compliments in the formal language of courtship. Eleanor watched them with a mixture of envy and disdain. Their clean, colourful clothes and practised manners seemed to belong to another world entirely. Yet they too were bound by Tudor expectations, the girls learning the social graces that might help them secure advantageous marriages, the boys practising the chivalric code that would serve them as future landowners and possibly courtiers. As the afternoon progressed, more adult-organised activities began. There was a maypole dance for grown-ups, Morris dancing with bells tied to the dancers' legs, and performances by travelling musicians. Children weaved through the crowds, playing impromptu games of tag, or simply watching the entertainment. "Want to play knucklebones?" asked Joan, producing a set of small bones from her pocket. Knucklebones was an ancient game, played with sheep ankle bones or sometimes stones. The player would toss one bone in the air and quickly pick up others before catching the tossed one. It required quick reflexes and dexterity. Eleanor and Sarah settled on the grass with Joan, taking turns at the game. As they played, Eleanor noticed how games varied with the seasons and available materials. In winter, when weather drove everyone indoors, quiet games like knucklebones, dice, or card games, for those who could afford cards, dominated. Spring brought outdoor games like the ones being played today. Summer meant swimming in the river and playing in the fields after harvest work, while autumn saw games with conkers, horse chestnuts threaded on strings and used to battle other children's conkers. Even the poorest Tudor children found ways to play. Those with no toys made their own. A stick became a hobby horse, mud could be shaped into crude figures, stones served as gaming pieces. Imagination cost nothing, and Tudor children had it in abundance. "Look, they're starting the Morris dance," Sarah pointed. Indeed, a group of men with bells strapped to their legs and ribbons on their arms had formed a line. The pipe and tabor player struck up a lively tune, and the dancers began their rhythmic steps, bells jingling with each movement. May Day was just one of many festival days that punctuated the Tudor calendar. There was Twelfth Night at the end of the Christmas season, when roles were reversed and a Lord of Misrule was appointed to oversee the festivities. Shrove Tuesday before Lent began was a day for pancake races and football matches. Midsummer bonfires marked the longest day of the year, while harvest festivals celebrated the gathering of crops in autumn. These festival days provided rare opportunities for Tudor children to simply be children, to play freely without the burden of work, if only for a few hours. They were precious moments of lightness in lives that were often hard and brief. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the May Day festivities showed no signs of slowing. Adults had begun dancing around the maypole now, their steps more complex than the children's earlier efforts. Ale flowed freely, and the atmosphere grew merrier. For Tudor children, such celebrations were also educational. They learned social customs, traditional songs and dances, and their place within the community. Play had purpose, preparing them for adult roles and responsibilities. "Come try the quoits," called a boy from near the blacksmith's forge, where someone had set up the ring-tossing game. Eleanor and her friends joined the small crowd. Quoits was played by tossing metal or rope rings over a spike driven into the ground. It required good aim and a steady hand, skills that translated well to adult work. As they took turns tossing the rings, conversation turned to other games played throughout the year. "My father lets me play chess sometimes," said William, the vicar's son. "He says it teaches strategy." Chess was indeed popular among the educated classes in Tudor England. King Henry VIII himself was known to enjoy the game, along with other board games like tables, similar to backgammon, and fox and geese. Such games were played by adults for entertainment, but were also considered valuable for teaching children logical thinking and planning. "We play fox and hound at home," Eleanor said. "My grandfather carved the pieces." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the football game, which had grown increasingly rough. One boy was being helped off the field, clutching his arm, while others continued the game unperturbed. Tudor games often had a physical edge that might shock modern sensibilities. Boys especially were encouraged to engage in rough play and sports that built strength and toughened them up. Swimming, wrestling, stick fighting, and hunting were all popular activities for boys who had time for them, primarily those from wealthier families. For girls, physical games were generally tamer, skipping games, dancing, and activities that developed grace and dexterity rather than brute strength. Yet Tudor girls, particularly from farming or working families, were hardly delicate flowers. They ran, climbed, and played actively alongside their brothers when allowed. "Eleanor, come see the puppet show." Sarah tugged at her sister's hand, pointing to where a small crowd had gathered around a portable booth draped with cloth. Puppet shows were popular entertainment in Tudor England, enjoyed by children and adults alike. This one featured hand puppets made of wood and cloth, acting out a traditional story of brave knights and fearsome dragons. The puppeteer's voice rose and fell dramatically as he moved his creations about the small stage. Sarah watched, entranced, while Eleanor's attention wandered to a group of older children playing a game called Hot Cockles. One player was blindfolded while kneeling with their head in another player's lap. The other players took turns striking the blindfolded person, who had to guess who had hit them. Tudor games often had an edge of mild cruelty or mockery that reflected the harsher realities of their society. Games like Hot Cockles, Shove-groat, similar to shovelboard, and Blowpoint, blowing a needle or small arrow toward a target, all contained elements of competition and sometimes physical discomfort. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor and Sarah tried their hands at a variety of games: hopscotch scratched in the dirt, a simplified version of bowls using small wooden balls, and logats, where players threw sticks at a stake in the ground, trying to land theirs closest to the target. What struck Eleanor, though she wouldn't have articulated it this way, was how games crossed the rigid social boundaries of Tudor society. The blacksmith's daughters played alongside the manor lord's son, the baker's apprentice competed against the yeoman farmer's children. Play created a temporary democracy in a world strictly divided by birth and wealth. Of course, some distinctions remained. The gentry children had finer toys, perhaps a hobby horse with a carved wooden head rather than just a stick, or a doll with a porcelain face instead of one made from rags or wood, but the fundamental nature of play transcended these material differences. As the sun began to set, parents started calling their children home. The May Day festivities would continue for adults well into the night, but children, especially younger ones, were expected to retire early. "Just a little longer, please," Sarah begged when their mother summoned them. "You've had your fun," their mother said firmly. "There's work tomorrow, holiday or no." And there it was, the constant reminder that play was the exception, not the rule, in Tudor childhood. Most days were filled with chores, lessons, or apprentice work, depending on a child's station in life. Games were snatched in brief moments between responsibilities, or reserved for special occasions like today. As they walked home across the darkening green, Eleanor and Sarah passed a group of boys playing a final game of Prisoner's Base, a team game where players tried to tag opponents while defending their own territory. The boys' shouts and laughter followed them down the lane. "I wish every day could be May Day," Sarah sighed. Eleanor squeezed her sister's hand. Then it wouldn't be special. Back home, their father was already in his chair by the fire, their mother bustling about preparing a light supper after the day's feasting. Tomorrow would bring a return to routine, helping in the forge for Eleanor, household tasks for Sarah, the endless cycle of Tudor work. But for today, they had played as children have always played, with imagination, energy, and joy. Their games, while shaped by their time and culture, shared the essential qualities of children's play throughout history: creativity, social bonding, skill development, and pure fun. As Eleanor helped her mother set out wooden bowls for their evening pottage, her mind was still on the day's games. She'd won 3 rounds of quoits, mastered a new skipping rhyme, and been chosen first for the maypole dance. Small triumphs in a small life, but sweet nonetheless. Later, tucked into the straw mattress she shared with Sarah, Eleanor listened to the distant sounds of adult revelry still continuing on the green. May Day was one of the few times when staying up late was permitted for grown-ups, though children were still expected to keep regular hours. "Tell me about the puppet show again," she whispered to her sister in the darkness. As Sarah recounted the tale of St. George slaying the dragon, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the toys she'd seen today: the vicar's son's fine cup and ball, the manor lord's daughter's painted doll, the simple clay marbles most village children played with. Tudor toys weren't mass-produced like modern ones, but crafted by hand, often by parents or local artisans, making each one unique. Some children had special toys that reflected their future roles: miniature tools for boys destined for trades, small household implements for girls who would become wives and mothers. Play blended seamlessly into preparation for adult life. Eleanor herself owned few toys: a cloth doll her mother had made, a set of knuckle bones passed down from a cousin, a small wooden spinning top her father had carved for her last Christmas. Yet she never felt deprived. Her games were limited only by imagination, not possessions. As Sarah's whispers slowed and finally stopped, replaced by the even breathing of sleep, Eleanor remained awake a little longer, reliving the day's pleasures. Tomorrow would bring work again, helping her mother with the washing, minding Sarah while their parents worked, feeding the chickens that scratched in the yard. But today's memories would sustain her until the next holiday brought new opportunities for play. In her mind, she went through all the games she knew, categorizing them by season and occasion. Winter brought indoor games by the fire, cards for families who could afford them, storytelling competitions, riddles and word games. Christmas season had its special activities. The Lord of Misrule, overseeing 12 days of revelry, was sailing from house to house, special dances and plays. Spring, like today, offered maypoles and outdoor games as the weather improved. Summer meant swimming in the village pond, running races at harvest festivals, playing hide-and-seek in the fields. Autumn brought games with fallen leaves, conkers from horse chestnut trees, and the exciting Guy Fawkes celebrations with bonfires and effigies. The Tudor calendar was punctuated with these opportunities for play, each festival bringing its own traditions and amusements. While daily life was dominated by work, these special days provided balance, moments of joy and community that helped make the hardships bearable. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last thoughts were of the next festival to look forward to, midsummer with its bonfires and dancing. Tudor childhood might be brief and burdened with responsibilities, but it still contained moments of pure childhood delight that transcended time and social station. Whether noble like Edward, a farmer's child like Agnes, a city apprentice like Thomas, or a blacksmith's daughter like Eleanor, Tudor children found ways to play, to laugh, to briefly escape the adult world that pressed in on them from all sides. In their games, they were simply children, creative, energetic, and free in a way that the small cottage was eerily quiet except for the laboured breathing coming from the box bed in the corner. 10-year-old Mary Cook sat beside her younger brother Will, gently dabbing his forehead with a damp cloth. His skin burned beneath her fingers. 3 days now he'd been like this, fever, rising and falling, his small body racked with violent coughing. Their mother had barely left Will's side, leaving Mary to tend the house and look after her other siblings. But now she'd gone to consult Goody Thompson, the village wise woman who knew all about herbs and remedies. Mary was alone with her sick brother, watching his chest rise and fall with each difficult breath. "Here, Will," she whispered, holding a wooden cup to his parched lips. "Drink a little." The liquid was a weak ale mixed with honey, one of the few things Will could keep down. He sipped listlessly, then turned his head away. Illness was a constant companion to Tudor children. In a world without antibiotics, vaccines, or even basic understanding of germs, disease could sweep through a family, a village, or an entire country with terrifying speed. Children were especially vulnerable, their small bodies often unable to fight off infections that we now consider minor. Mary smoothed Will's damp hair back from his forehead. At 6 years old, he'd already survived longer than many Tudor children. Their own sister, little Emma, had died before her second birthday, carried off by a fever similar to the one now gripping Will. Another brother had been stillborn the year before Mary herself was born. This was the reality of Tudor childhood. Death was not an abstract concept, but a familiar presence. Children grew up watching siblings, friends, and neighbours succumb to disease, accident, or malnutrition. Parents didn't dare become too attached to infants, knowing the heartbreaking odds they faced. The door creaked open and Mary's mother entered, her face lined with worry and fatigue. Behind her came Goody Thompson, a stooped elderly woman carrying a small basket of herbs. "How is he?" her mother asked, hurrying to the bedside. "The fever's still high," Mary replied, standing to make room. Goody Thompson approached, her gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle as she felt Will's forehead and checked his pulse. In Tudor villages, such women were the closest thing to healthcare professionals. Their knowledge, passed down through generations of women, combined practical observation with folk remedies and sometimes superstition. "The lungwort tea didn't help?" the old woman asked, peering at Will's flushed face. Mary's mother shook her head. "The coughing's worse at night. He brings up terrible stuff, yellow and thick." Goody Thompson nodded grimly, then opened her basket. "We'll try a poultice of mustard and garlic for his chest, and this tea of coltsfoot and horehound for the cough." She pulled out small bundles of dried herbs, their pungent smell filling the small room. "Keep him warm but not too hot. And hang this above his bed." She handed Mary's mother a small cloth pouch on a string. Mary caught a whiff of its contents, something bitter and earthy. Tudor medicine was a curious mixture of practical herbal knowledge, religious faith, and superstition. Some remedies, like willow bark for pain, containing natural salicylates similar to aspirin, were effective. Others, like wearing bags of herbs to ward off disease, had more psychological than physical benefits. For wealthier families like Edward Radcliffe's, illness might mean a visit from a physician, university-trained doctors who based their practice on ancient Greek and Roman medical texts. These physicians often relied on the theory of humours, the belief that the body contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, that needed to be balanced for good health. Their treatments could be harsh, bloodletting to reduce excess blood, or purging with powerful laxatives to expel bad humours from the body. Ironically, such interventions often weakened already sick patients, particularly children. But for common families like Mary's, medical care meant home remedies, wise women like Goody Thompson, or perhaps the local barber surgeon who could set broken bones, pull teeth, or perform simple surgeries, all without anaesthesia beyond perhaps a shot of strong alcohol. Mary watched as her mother and Goody Thompson mixed herbs with hot water to make a poultice. The mustard's sharp smell made her eyes water. "Bare his chest," the old woman instructed. "Apply this directly to the skin. Yes, like that. Now cover with a warm cloth." Will whimpered as the hot poultice touched his skin, but was too weak to protest further. Mary bit her lip, fighting back tears. She'd seen enough childhood illness to know the signs. Will was very sick indeed. Whether he would recover depended on his own strength and pure luck as much as any remedy. "Mary," her mother said quietly, "go check on the little ones and put the pot on for supper." Mary nodded and reluctantly left the sick room. Her younger siblings, 3-year-old Alice and 2-year-old John, were playing quietly in the main room, unusually subdued, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. She stirred up the banked fire and hung a pot of pottage over it to heat for their evening meal. Outside the window, life in the village continued. Men worked in the fields, women carried water or hung laundry, other children played. Yet inside this cottage, and countless others like it across Tudor England, the shadow of illness created a different world, one of whispers, anxiety, and desperate hope. At sunset, Goody Thompson left with instructions for the night. "Give him the tea every 2 hours, she told Mary's mother. "Keep the poultice fresh. If the fever breaks, he may turn the corner. If not," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Mary helped prepare the younger children for bed, feeding them, washing their faces and hands, and settling them on their straw mattress in the loft. Then she returned to Will's bedside, allowing her exhausted mother a brief rest. In the flickering light of a rush candle, a reed dipped in animal fat, the cheapest form of lighting, Will's face looked waxen. Mary dipped the cloth in cool water again and wiped his forehead, cheeks and neck, just as she'd seen her mother do. "Please get better," she whispered, more prayer than conversation. Childhood illness affected all classes in Tudor society, though not equally. The children of the poor, crowded into unsanitary housing with inadequate nutrition, suffered most frequently and severely, but even royal children weren't immune. King Henry VIII had lost several children in infancy, and his sickly son Edward VI would die at just 15, possibly from tuberculosis. The dreaded sweating sickness, a mysterious and rapidly fatal disease that appeared in several epidemics during the Tudor period, was particularly feared because it seemed to affect the healthy and wealthy as much as the poor. Its victims could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner, sweating profusely throughout their rapid decline. Other common childhood killers included smallpox, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, and various fevers that modern medicine would identify as infections ranging from influenza to meningitis. Tuberculosis, called consumption because it seemed to consume the body from within, was a slow killer that claimed many lives over months or years. Accidents, too, took a terrible toll on Tudor children. Burns from open fires, drownings in streams or wells, falls from trees or buildings, kicks from horses. The everyday world held countless dangers for young ones without modern safety measures. Through the night, Mary and her mother took turns sitting with Will, giving him sips of the herbal tea and changing his poultice. Near dawn, his fever seemed to spike higher than ever. He thrashed weakly, muttering words they couldn't understand, his eyes unfocused. "Should we call the priest?" Mary asked fearfully. In Tudor England, spiritual care was considered as important as physical remedies. If Will was dying, he would need last rites to ensure his soul's safe passage. Her mother hesitated, then shook her head. Not yet. The crisis often comes before healing. As grey light filtered through the shutters, Will finally fell into a quieter sleep. His breathing, though still laboured, seemed less desperate. Mary's mother placed a hand on his forehead. "The fever's breaking," she whispered, the first hope in her voice for days. Mary let out the breath she hadn't realised she was holding. Will wasn't out of danger yet, but this was a positive sign. Many Tudor children rallied from the brink only to survive and thrive, developing immunities that would help them face future illnesses. Recovery, however, could be a long process. Without modern antibiotics to clear infections completely, children often suffered lingering effects or complications. Fevers could damage hearing, severe illnesses might leave a child weakened for months. Those who survived to adulthood often carried the physical marks of childhood diseases, pockmarks from smallpox, twisted limbs from rickets, or the sunken chest of recovered tuberculosis. By mid-morning, Will was able to take a few spoonfuls of broth. Mary's mother, exhausted but relieved, finally slept while Mary kept watch and managed the household. She fed the younger children, swept the packed earth floor, and put bean pottage on to cook slowly through the day. Outside, she could hear other children playing, their lives continuing normally while her families had been suspended in the timeless anxiety of the sick room. Soon, she hoped, Will would be among them again, but she knew not every story ended this way. In the small churchyard, tiny graves outnumbered adult ones, silent testimony to the fragility of Tudor childhood. Across the village at the manor house, another child was ill, though under very different circumstances. Lady Catherine, the 9-year-old daughter of Sir Richard Hartwell, lay in a canopied bed in a private chamber. Unlike Will's straw mattress in the family's main room, Lady Catherine had a proper feather bed with linen sheets and wool blankets. Her mother sat nearby reading softly from a prayer book while a maidservant adjusted the heavy curtains to keep drafts away from the sick child. Tudor medicine believed strongly in the danger of bad air or miasmas that could cause disease. Keeping windows closed during illness was standard practice, though it ironically often made recovery harder by trapping stale air and germs. "The physician will return this afternoon," Lady Hartwell told her daughter, closing the book. "He says your humours are improving after the bleeding." Lady Catherine nodded weakly. Yesterday the physician, an expensive luxury only the wealthy could afford, had cut her arm and drained a bowl of blood, claiming this would reduce the excess heat causing her fever. The small wound still throbbed beneath its bandage. On a table nearby sat an ornate box containing various medicines prescribed by the physician, syrups made with expensive imported ingredients like saffron and cinnamon, cordials containing gold flakes, believed to have healing properties due to their value, and aromatic vinegars to purify the air. The treatment of a noble child's illness could be just as ineffective as a peasant's home remedies despite the cost and sophistication. In some cases, the poor child with a wise woman's herbal knowledge might actually receive more beneficial care than the rich one subjected to bleeding and purging. Both Mary's brother and Lady Catherine suffered from what was likely the same respiratory infection. Will was treated with herbal remedies that may have had some actual medicinal properties, while Catherine endured bloodletting that weakened her further. Yet social class determined everything about their experience of the same illness, from the bed they lay in to the food they ate during recovery. By afternoon, Will was definitely improving. His fever had broken, and though he remained weak and the cough persisted, he was alert enough to ask for water instead of just passively accepting it. "You gave us a fright," Mary told him, helping him sit up slightly against a folded blanket. The crisis had passed, but recovery would take time. For days or weeks, Will would remain vulnerable, gradually regaining strength. His parents would watch anxiously for any sign of relapse or complication. At the manor house, Lady Catherine was also slowly improving, despite rather than because of her physician's interventions. Her natural resilience was asserting itself, her young body fighting off the infection. "Perhaps we might try a little watered wine with honey," her mother suggested, dismissing the maidservant with a wave. "The physician says it will restore your spirits." Across Tudor England, similar scenes played out daily. In London, Thomas the apprentice cooper might find himself nursed through illness by his master's wife, who would balance concern for the boy with the practical need to get him back to work as soon as possible. In the royal palace, Prince Edward would have been attended by the finest physicians in the land, his every symptom discussed and analysed by multiple medical experts, though their treatments would be based on the same flawed understanding of disease as everyone else's. The key difference was not in the quality of medical knowledge, which was limited at all levels of society, but in the comfort provided during illness. A noble child recovered in clean linens with nourishing food. A poor child might share a bed with siblings even while ill and subsist on thin broth during recovery. Mary's mother woke from her brief rest and checked on Will again. "His colour's better," she said, relief evident in her voice. "We should give thanks to God for sparing him." Religion and medicine were inseparable in Tudor minds. Illness might be treated with herbs or bleeding, but prayer was considered equally important to recovery. Churches kept records of miraculous cures attributed to saints or religious relics, while families made offerings in thanks for a child's recovery. The next morning, Will was able to sit up and take a small bowl of pottage. The tight knot of fear in Mary's chest began to loosen. This time they had been lucky. This time death had passed over their house. In Tudor England, every childhood illness was potentially fatal. Medical knowledge was limited, with no understanding of germs, infection, or the mechanisms of disease. Treatments were based on ancient texts, folk wisdom, and traditional practices that had changed little for centuries. Yet children did survive. Through some combination of natural immunity, effective herbal remedies, good nursing care, and simple luck, many Tudor children overcame illnesses that claimed their peers. Those who survived to adulthood often carried immunities that helped them navigate the disease-ridden world they inhabited. By week's end, Will was well enough to leave his bed briefly, sitting wrapped in blankets near the fire. His face was thin, cheeks hollowed by the illness, but his eyes were bright again. Mary felt a surge of fierce love for her little brother, along with the pragmatic relief that came from not having to manage the household alone anymore. "Tell me a story," Will asked, his voice still hoarse from coughing. Mary settled beside him and began a tale she'd heard from Goody Thompson, a story about fairies who stole a miller's child and left a changeling in its place. Tudor folklore was filled with such stories, reflecting both the magical thinking of the era and the reality of childhood illness. When a previously healthy child suddenly became sickly or behaved strangely, the explanation might be a fairy substitution rather than disease. As she spun the familiar tale, Mary noticed how the illness had aged Will beyond his 6 years. Tudor children who survived serious illness often seemed to mature rapidly, their faces taking on a gravity that came from brushing against mortality. Across England, countless other children were experiencing similar brushes with death. Some would recover like Will, others would join the heartbreaking statistics of child mortality that defined the era. Each family had its own remedies, its own rituals for nursing the sick, its own ways of coping with the constant spectre of loss. For the wealthy, like Lady Catherine, illness might mean expensive physicians, exotic medicines, and the luxury of extended recovery time. For middling families like Mary's, it meant herbal remedies, careful nursing, and the shared wisdom of community healers like Goody Thompson. For the poorest, it often meant minimal care while parents continued working to survive, and perhaps a quiet, resigned grief when death came, as it so often did. By the Tudor period, some advances were slowly improving children's chances. The worst of the medieval plagues had subsided, nutrition was generally better than in previous centuries, and some effective herbal treatments had been identified through trial and error over generations. Yet childhood remained perilous. The concept of preventative healthcare didn't exist. Sanitation was rudimentary at best, with human waste dumped in streets or rivers that might also serve as water sources. Diet was seasonal and often inadequate in vital nutrients, leading to deficiency diseases like rickets and scurvy. Even surviving a serious illness didn't guarantee a healthy future. Will's lungs might be permanently weakened, making him more susceptible to future respiratory infections. Lady Catherine might find her growth stunted by the combined effects of illness and bloodletting. Complications could appear weeks or months later, a secondary infection taking hold in a body still recovering. In the face of these realities, Tudor families developed remarkable resilience. They knew all too well that not every child would survive to adulthood, yet they continued to invest in their children's futures, teaching skills, arranging apprenticeships, planning marriages, passing down trades and farms. This resilience extended to the children themselves. Those who survived serious illness often developed a matter-of-fact relationship with mortality that might seem strange to modern sensibilities. They understood the fragility of life in ways few modern children do. Mary tucked the blanket more securely around Will's shoulders. "When you're stronger, we'll go to church to give thanks," she told him. Recovery typically included a public acknowledgement of God's mercy, another reminder that survival was seen as something of a miracle. "Did you do all my chores while I was sick?" Will asked, a hint of his usual mischief returning. Mary smiled. "Someone had to, but you'll make it up to me when you're better." That was the reality of Tudor childhood illness. It disrupted not just the sick child's life, but the entire household's functioning. Siblings took on extra responsibilities, parents lost precious working time to provide care. The economic stability of the family might be threatened by a prolonged illness. The light was fading now, the cottage growing dim as evening approached. Mary's mother returned from feeding the chickens and checking on their small garden. "Time for Will's medicine," she said, reaching for the packet of dried herbs Goody Thompson had left, and then rest again. Though Will was recovering, his care would continue. Herbal teas to ease his lingering cough, nourishing broths to rebuild his strength, careful protection from draughts or damp that might cause a relapse. Recovery in Tudor times was a gradual process, each small improvement celebrated, each setback noted with concern. As her mother prepared the herbal infusion, Mary gazed out the small window at the spring evening. In the distance, she could see other village children playing, their shouts carried on the breeze. Soon, Will would be among them again, the memory of his illness fading like so many childhood experiences. For now, though, he remained in the liminal space of convalescence, no longer desperately ill, but not yet well, caught between the shadow of what might have been and the promise of return to normal life. This too was part of Tudor childhood, these periods of recovery, of gradual return to strength, of reintegration into the rhythms of daily life. Mary watched as Will dutifully drank his medicine, making a face at the bitter taste. Some things, it seemed, were universal across time. Children's dislike of medicine, their impatience with confinement, their resilience in the face of hardship. As darkness fell completely, Mary's father returned from his work at the village forge, his face lighting with relief when he saw Will sitting up. Though Tudor men weren't typically involved in nursing sick children, considered women's work, they felt the same fear and worry, the same relief when danger passed. "You'll be my helper again soon, eh, lad?" he said gruffly, ruffling Will's hair with a blacksmith's calloused hand. Will nodded eagerly. "I'm much better. Maybe tomorrow?" "When your mother says you're ready," came the diplomatic reply. Tudor fathers had a different relationship with their children than modern ones. They were authority figures first and foremost, responsible for discipline and providing for the family. Emotional demonstrations weren't common, yet the bond was real and deep. A child's illness revealed the depth of feeling that daily life might obscure. As the family gathered for their evening meal and prayers, the atmosphere was lighter than it had been in days. Will was propped up in his bed, taking a small portion of food. The immediate crisis had passed. Yet Mary, helping her mother serve the simple meal, understood what remained unspoken, that Will's recovery wasn't guaranteed, that complications could still arise, that other illnesses would certainly come in future seasons. Tudor life required accepting this uncertainty, living fully despite it, finding joy in survival without expecting it as a right. This perspective shaped Tudor childhood in profound ways, creating young people who understood both the preciousness and precariousness of life. children who survived serious illness often carried that knowledge forward, visible in the gravity that sometimes looks out at us from Tudor portraits of young faces. As darkness settled fully over the village and the family prepared for sleep, Mary whispered one final prayer of thanks that her brother had been spared. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for tonight their family remained intact, having weathered one more of life's storms together. Summer 1536. 10 years have passed since we first met our Tudor children. The world has changed around them. King Henry VIII has broken from Rome, dissolved monasteries across England, and is now on his third wife. But for ordinary people, life continues in its familiar rhythms, though with new prayers and different holy days. Let's check in on our Tudor children, who aren't really children anymore. In a manor house in Hampshire, Edward Radcliffe stands beside his father in a wood-panelled study. At 17, he's nearly a man grown, tall and lean, with the first shadow of a beard darkening his jaw. His doublet is fine green wool, his hose are sober black. A small ruff encircles his neck, the newest fashion. "The papers are all in order," says Sir Thomas, sliding a document across the heavy oak table. "Dartmouth College at Oxford has accepted you for Michaelmas term. You'll be the first Radcliffe to attend university." Edward nods, a mixture of pride and apprehension on his face. 10 years of education have led to this moment. While many noble sons went directly from home tutoring into court service or military training, Edward's scholarly aptitude has opened a different path. "I won't disappoint you, father." Sir Thomas clears his throat, uncomfortable with sentiment. "See that you don't. It's costing me £40 a year." That was a substantial sum, more than most Tudor families saw in several years combined. But education was an investment in the family's future prominence, a way to position the next generation for advancement. For Edward, university would mean entering a world of intensive study, Latin and Greek, rhetoric, philosophy, theology and mathematics. He would live in Spartan conditions with other students, rise at dawn for prayers, and spend his days in lectures and disputations. The goal wasn't just knowledge, but connections, friendships with the sons of other important families who might provide opportunities later in life. Not every noble son was suited for such a path. Edward's younger brother George, now 15, had shown little aptitude for books. Instead, arrangements had been made for him to join the household of the Earl of Southampton as a page, learning the ways of court and martial skills. From there, he might progress to become a squire and eventually a knight, or find a position in government administration. For noble girls, the path to adulthood was more prescribed. Edward's sister Elizabeth, now 19, had been married for 2 years to the son of a neighbouring landowner, an arrangement negotiated when she was just 14. The marriage strengthened ties between the families and included a substantial dowry from Sir Thomas. Elizabeth now ran her own household, managing servants and overseeing domestic production. She had already given birth to her first child and was expecting another. If she was fortunate, she would survive the dangerous childbearing years that claimed so many Tudor women. Miles away in the small farming village, Agnes Fletcher was also experiencing a transition to adulthood, though very different from Elizabeth's. At 19, Agnes remained unmarried, unusual but not unheard of for a yeoman's daughter. "The butter's ready for market," she told her father as they loaded a cart with goods for the next day's journey to town. Unlike noble women who married young, rural women often married in their mid-20s after years of working for their families or in service to others. Agnes had become essential to her family's growing prosperity. The Fletchers now farmed more land than they had 10 years ago, with 3 cows instead of 2, more sheep and a larger garden plot. Agnes managed the dairy production, making butter and cheese that sold well at the market. Her mother, now in her 40s and considered quite elderly by Tudor standards, increasingly relied on Agnes's strength and skills. "Miller's son asked about you again," her father mentioned casually as they worked. Agnes said nothing, but a slight flush coloured her cheeks. Robert Miller was a good match. His father owned the village mill, a position of some importance and security. If she married him, she would not go far from her family, yet would improve her station slightly. Unlike noble marriages arranged for political or financial advantage, common folk had more choice in their partners. Love matches were possible, though practical considerations of character and economic stability typically weighed heavily in the decision. Marriage would mean establishing her own household, bearing and raising children, continuing the cycle of Tudor life. The skills she'd spent her childhood and adolescence mastering would serve her well as a wife and mother. At 23, Thomas Baker was no longer an apprentice, but a journeyman cooper, having successfully completed his 7-year training. The gangly 13-year-old had grown into a stocky, serious young man with powerful arms developed through years of shaping barrel staves. Thomas now worked for wages in his former master's shop, saving carefully toward his ultimate goal, becoming a master cooper himself with his own workshop and apprentices. This would require not just skill and capital, but acceptance by the Coopers Guild and the purchase of freedom of the city, the right to operate a business independently. 3 more seams on this one, he told Peter, now 21, and also a journeyman. They worked side by side on a large wine cask for a merchant who supplied the king's court. 10 years of training had made their movements efficient and precise, each stroke of the adze or plane exactly where it needed to be. London had grown familiar to Thomas over the years, its narrow streets and crowded buildings as much home now as the Kent village where he was born. He'd survived disease outbreaks that periodically swept through the crowded city, including a bout of the sweating sickness that had nearly claimed him 3 summers ago. The city itself had changed too. The break with Rome had led to the dissolution of monasteries, many of which had stood for centuries. The religious houses that had provided charity, education, and medical care were being demolished or repurposed, their lands and wealth seized by the crown. For ambitious craftsmen like Thomas, these changes brought both opportunity and uncertainty. Traditional patterns of commerce and patronage were shifting. New wealthy classes were emerging as monastery lands were sold off to those who could afford them. Master Cooper says he may retire next year, Peter mentioned casually as they worked. His son doesn't want the business. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. It was a tantalizing possibility, taking over an established cooper's shop rather than starting from scratch, but it would require capital he didn't yet have. "My uncle in Bristol might lend me part," he said, thinking aloud. Family connections and credit arrangements were essential for advancement in Tudor trades. From apprentice to journeyman to master, this was the traditional progression for men in Tudor crafts, a path that led to independence and respectability. Those who completed this journey could expect to become householders and eventually guild members, with all the social and economic benefits that entailed. Meanwhile, in the blacksmith's cottage, Eleanor sat with her mother stitching a linen shift. At 20, she was preparing for her wedding to Jacob Turner, the carpenter's son from the neighbouring village. The marriage represented a slight step up socially. Carpenters typically earned more than blacksmiths. "The blue thread for the neckline, I think," her mother said, sorting through a small basket of sewing supplies. The shift would be part of Eleanor's modest trousseau, the clothing and household goods she would bring to her marriage. Unlike noble women whose marriages were arranged for alliance and advantage, Eleanor had grown into her match gradually. She'd known Jacob since childhood, their friendship evolving naturally into courtship as they entered their late teens. Father says Jacob may take over the old Watkins cottage after the wedding, Eleanor said, her needle flashing in the afternoon light from the window. Once he repairs the roof. Her mother nodded approvingly. Housing was a crucial consideration for newly married couples. Some might live with parents initially, but establishing a separate household was the ideal when economically feasible. The wedding itself would be a community celebration much simpler than a noble marriage, but still marked with customs and festivities. There would be a church ceremony followed by feasting and dancing, gifts of household items from family and friends, and traditional ribald jokes about the wedding night. For both Eleanor and Jacob, marriage marked full entry into adult society. They would be expected to establish a household, bear children, participate in village governance for Jacob, and contribute to community life. Their childhood was well and truly over. In a small market town not far from London, Mary Cook, now 20, moved efficiently around the apothecary shop where she worked. After her brother Will's illness 10 years ago, she had developed an interest in herbal medicine, learning everything she could from the village wise woman. That interest had led her to an unusual position for a woman, assistant to Master Williams, an apothecary who prepared medicines prescribed by physicians. While not as prestigious as a physician or surgeon, apothecaries played an important role in Tudor healthcare, mixing herbs, minerals, and other substances into medicinal preparations. The foxglove tincture for Lady Somerset is ready, Mary told her employer, a thin man with ink-stained fingers from writing labels and prescriptions. Good. Add it to her order with the rosewater and the sleeping draught. Unlike her friend Agnes, Mary had chosen a path that didn't immediately lead to marriage. Some Tudor women found niches in trades traditionally dominated by men, but not entirely closed to them. Brewing, midwifery, some types of retail, and occasionally medicine. While these women were exceptions to the usual pattern of marriage and motherhood, they weren't complete anomalies. Mary had found that her careful nature and good memory served her well in the apothecary shop. She could recall the properties of dozens of herbs, the correct proportions for common remedies, and which preparations would complement or counteract each other. Master Williams, who had no sons but needed help as his eyesight failed, had been willing to train her beyond what a typical shop girl might learn. Of course, Mary's position was precarious in ways a man's wouldn't be. She could assist in the shop, but could never become a master apothecary herself. If she married, she would be expected to give up this work for household management. If Master Williams died or retired, his business would likely be sold to another male apothecary who might not want a female assistant. Yet, for now, she had found a place that suited her, using her knowledge to help others as Goody Thompson had helped her brother years ago. Will had survived that illness and grown into a sturdy 16-year-old, apprenticed to the village miller. Each of our Tudor young people had followed a path largely determined by their birth, yet shaped by their particular abilities and circumstances. The rigid social structure of Tudor England didn't prevent all individual variation, though it certainly constrained the options available to most people. Edward's university education would likely lead to a career in law, church administration, or government service, respectable professions for younger sons of the gentry. His sister Elizabeth was already fulfilling her expected role as wife and mother. George would probably serve in a noble household until he could secure lands of his own through service or marriage. Agnes and Eleanor were following the typical path for rural women, mastering household skills, marrying within their social class, and preparing to run their own households and raise the next generation. Thomas was working toward master craftsman status, the pinnacle of achievement for a boy from his background. Mary's less conventional role showed that even in the structured Tudor world, individual talents sometimes found unexpected outlets. While women's lives were generally more constrained than men's, the practical needs of society sometimes created openings for women with particular skills or in special circumstances. The childhood we've glimpsed through these different lives had prepared each of them for their adult roles, noble, rural, urban, male, female, each shaped by the expectations of their time and place. The education they received, whether formal schooling or practical training, had been carefully calculated to fit them for their predestined social positions. Yet within those boundaries, we can see the universal aspects of human development: curiosity, play, learning, illness, growth, and the gradual assumption of adult responsibilities. Tudor children, for all the differences in their daily lives and future prospects, experience many of the same fundamental transitions as children in any era. As our Tudor young people step fully into adulthood, we can see how their childhood experiences shaped them. Edward's years of Latin grammar and classical studies prepared him for university life. Agnes's early training in dairy work gave her a valuable skill that enhanced her marriage prospects. Thomas's apprenticeship provided him with both technical ability and business connections essential for advancement. Their childhoods had been brief by modern standards, with adult responsibilities coming early and little of what we would now call adolescence. Yet they were not without joy, friendship, or moments of simple pleasure amid the work and learning that dominated their young lives. In many ways, the paths they followed would be recognizable for generations to come, until the Industrial Revolution dramatically reorganized society. Most children would continue to experience childhood, much as Tudor children did, as a time of training for predetermined adult roles with education tailored to social status and gender. What has changed most dramatically is not the activities themselves. Modern children still learn, play, and gradually take on responsibilities, but our understanding of childhood as a distinct and protected phase of life. Tudor society viewed children essentially as adults in training, their value measured primarily by their future utility rather than their present experiences. Yet even within this utilitarian framework, we can glimpse moments of connection that transcend time: a mother's concern during illness, a child's delight in play, a father's gruff pride in a son's accomplishments. These human bonds remained constant even as the specific circumstances of Tudor life differed dramatically from our own. As the sun sets on our journey through Tudor childhood, we might reflect on both the vast differences that 5 centuries have brought and the surprising continuities in human experience. Children still learn through play and observation, still form identities shaped by their social context, still move gradually from dependence to autonomy. The paths that Edward, Agnes, Thomas, Eleanor, and Mary followed were largely predetermined by birth in a way that would seem foreign to modern sensibilities, yet each of them found ways to express their individual natures within those constraints. Edward through scholarship, Agnes through skilled dairy work, Thomas through craftsmanship, Eleanor through community connections, and Mary through her unusual position in medical care. Perhaps the most significant difference lies not in what Tudor children did, but in how childhood itself was understood. Today, we see childhood as a time of protected development, with education aimed at unlocking potential rather than fitting children into predefined roles. We value play for its own sake, not merely as preparation for adult skills. Yet in both eras, childhood remains a time of remarkable growth and adaptation. The Tudor children we've followed absorbed the complex skills and knowledge they would need for adulthood, from Latin declensions to barrel-making techniques to the medicinal properties of plants. Their education, whether formal or practical, was comprehensive within its sphere. As night falls across the Tudor landscape, from Edward's college chambers at Oxford to Agnes's farmhouse, from Thomas's London workshop to Eleanor's new marital home, from Mary's room above the apothecary shop, we leave our former children now grown, each following the path laid out for them by birth and circumstance, yet each bringing their unique character to the journey. Their world, so different from ours with its rigid hierarchies, religious conformity and limited horizons, nonetheless contained the same human experiences that define all childhoods: learning and growth, play and work, illness and recovery, and the gradual, sometimes difficult transition to independence. As you lie in your comfortable modern bed, far from the straw mattresses and wooden pallets of Tudor children, perhaps there's something to learn from their resilience, their practical skills, their early assumption of responsibility. Though we wouldn't wish to return to a time of such high child mortality and limited opportunity, we might appreciate the sense of purpose and connection that structured their young lives. The stars that shine tonight are the same ones that look down on Tudor England. The human needs for learning, belonging, and finding one's place in the world remain constant across the centuries. In that continuity lies a profound connection between their world and ours, their childhoods, and our own. And with that thought, close your eyes and drift off to sleep, travelling through time in your dreams, perhaps to visit those Tudor children we've come to know, now grown and making their way in a world both strange and familiar.